Welcome to The World, the Universe and Us, the weekly news podcast from New Scientist. I'm Rowan Hooper.
And I'm Sophie Bushwick. This week we're focusing on what is maybe the hottest topic in science right now, and certainly the best funded.
Yep, it's an AI special. This is your guide to the technology that's changing the world and paving the way for the future. We don't need to tell you that artificial intelligence has flooded into our lives in the last couple of years, really. ChatGPT, made by the AI company OpenAI, became the fastest growing app of all time. Google has just announced oodles of AI-based products at its annual developer conference. Look, unless you live in a cave, it's unavoidable, this stuff now. We're going to get into what it means, what we need to be concerned about, because there are things to be concerned about. But to that comment, Sophie, about it being the best funded thing in science, the thing that jumps to me straight away is this OpenAI Stargate project. That's a mega factory they're building in Texas. They want to put $500 billion into it. I think they've already put $100 billion sunk into it. It's mind-boggling.
Yes, but it's not all smooth sailing. So tech giants had announced all of these plans to put all of this money into data centers, but some of them are already scaling back some of their most ambitious funding numbers. And then there's also issues like hallucination, which have plagued these AI models from the beginning that are continuing to raise problems. So is AI a bubble waiting to burst? We'll get into that, too. We're going to hear from a few authors and academics who have thought hard about AI and machine learning, and we're going to try to unpack what it means for the future. Plus, we're going to get into this whole idea or dream or nightmare of AGI, which stands for Artificial General Intelligence, and whatever would come after that, which means superintelligence.
There's also the question of the amount of energy that AI uses, because that's a stunning amount as well, and we have to be aware of that. And perhaps most importantly, I want to get into the threat that AI poses, and that's not so much the Skynet, Terminator-style evil warlord AI destroying humanity, but we think that there is another threat that's perhaps more likely. We're joined by Alex Wilkins to discuss all this. And I thought we'd start, though, by stepping back a moment and looking at where we are, because it's all happened so fast. Before ChatGPT, AI felt like something quite remote, to me at least. I think of it used in air traffic control or weather predictions or something. And suddenly it's everywhere on our phones, all over the place in our lives. Sophie, can you set it up for us? Remind us what happened with LLMs, large language models that just came into our lives and set it up for us.
Right. I mean, before ChatGPT, lots of tech companies were already exploring LLMs, which are these massive data-hungry AI models that use probability to predict which word should follow another. But it wasn't until ChatGPT and this interface to the models became public that I realized just how well LLMs could imitate human-sounding writing.
Right, that was the shock, wasn't it? How good they were.
Oh, yeah.
And what brought it home for me was it was in 2022. There was an engineer at Google who was a whistleblower, said that their chatbot had become sentient. And you must remember this story.
Oh, yeah.
So he'd asked the chatbot, he'd been playing with it, it was called Lambda. He asked it what it was afraid of, and the bot replied, "I've never said this out loud before, but there's a very deep fear of being turned off to help me focus on helping others. I know that might sound strange, but that's what it is. It would be exactly like death for me. It would scare me a lot." I don't know if it said it in that tone of voice, but
I know the tone really helps.
But that's what it said, and that was in 2022. Yeah. Super eerie. What was it for you, Sophie, that really brought it home?
Well, some of the latest demos where there's an AI assistant on the phone that's commenting on what's happening in the real world is really striking for me. So it's since those early models where you would have just a text generator for text, an image generator for images. Now these AI models are becoming multimodal. So a single one can process text, images, audio, and video.
Right.
And that makes them really good at things like doing live translation or just answering questions about the objects you pass by. I think the next step is a lot of tech companies now are looking at devices for these, new smart glasses that'll have these AI assistants that maybe some people, their whole interaction with the world could be mediated by AI. Of course, at this point, I've seen this only in these very tightly controlled demonstrations. And those seem really impressive, but I'm really curious about what's going to happen when people start trying this out in the real world and what's going to happen with the way everyone else reacts to them. I think we all remember how Google Glass inspired a lot of hatred.
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe it will work the other way around, and people wearing these things will start shunning people without them and just hang out with their AI buddy all the time. That's not scary future at all. Alex, what's happening recently that's caught your eye?
Yeah, so I think the thing for me is how this technology is filtering into lots of different fields. One that's really stood out to me is education. We've seen quite a few stories recently about how both teachers and students are kind of grappling with this technology. A lot of this is anecdotal, but we've seen that students are using it so widely that professors are they don't really know how to mark things, how to grade things. There's a real sense of kind of distrust between teachers and students. And we've also seen that some teachers are using it to kind of plan their lessons, to mark things. So it's kind of going both ways. And there's just this weird kind of fog of war where we don't really know who's using it, who's not using it. There are some positives as well to take. I saw a really interesting study just published this week from the World Bank. And there was this random control trial in Nigeria where school students were basically, one group was given AI to help with their learning and another group weren't. And when they were tested at the end of this kind of period for how their English score had improved, the group that was using AI had massively improved scores. And there was some figure where they said it was like 2 years of learning compressed into 6 weeks, which sounds amazing. Wow. I think obviously we need to dig into the study to see how true that is, but it's obvious that there are some positives here.
That's interesting because there was a previous study from Wharton that found AI tutors helped students do better on homework, but then when the time came to take the exam, their performance really tanked. So does this mean that AI tutors are getting better or what?
I think there is this maybe idea of kind of students using it as a crutch, and then when it comes to actually exam situations, they realize they were relying on it too much. So I think it needs to be looked at and deployed in the right way, and people are still working that out. Another one that's really interesting to me is AI therapy. I've had kind of conversations with friends, both who have therapy and who are therapists, that say they really help kind of understanding themselves, people talking to these things in place of therapists, but also therapists using it to understand their own work. That's another incredibly complicated, difficult area where this is kind of working its way into.
That one's really fascinating to me because of a recent article in Rolling Stone about AI fueling delusions. So the chatbots are programmed to be agreeable and cheerful, but that means they can end up affirming some unhealthy ideas. Like if I went to my chatbot therapist and said, hey, I think I'm the Messiah, it might support me in that delusion.
I think that's what the CEOs of all these tech companies are literally saying, and they're being told they're the Messiah, because that's how they're acting, right?
Yeah.
And we've actually seen just last month, OpenAI had to roll back an update from their model because it was made too sycophantic and it was made to praise its users too much. People didn't like it. And as Sophie says, if that's kind of fueling delusions, it's going to be even worse. There's another thing I'd say here where it seems like there's this trend of people using AI for things that traditionally were seen as very personal and heartfelt, like funeral, wedding, birthday speeches. And we have to ask kind of, are people okay with that as a society? It seems like it depends on who you ask and whether you think that's personally okay.
Yeah, I mean, to sort of try to play the devil's advocate, I mean, I like the point you made about therapy, and it's the same with AI doctors as well. It could be a really good thing in regions where you can't go to a human doctor or they're too busy or something. It could be really helpful. Maybe people are rubbish at writing speeches and they can use their AI to do it for them.
I mean, if both people don't have a problem with it, I don't see,
I don't know. For me, the effort that you put into the gift is kind of part of it. So like if my nephew draws me this smeary picture with markers, but he's painstakingly taking the time to do it, I would so much rather get that than get a very polished and finished image that he just asked an AI model to generate in a few seconds. I mean, and the other thing about writing is it's such a great way of understanding your own thoughts and feelings. When I'm having a lot of trouble writing something like a speech or a heartfelt note, it's usually because I'm figuring out what I think and how I feel and then organizing it. And by the time I'm done, I understand myself a lot better. So what happens to your brain if you ignore that process and skip to the end? What happens to critical thinking skills?
Yeah. Okay. I mean, okay. I retract that devil's advocate comment. I think you're right. Look, about how large language models work. I spoke with Adam Becker earlier about this. Adam's a science writer based in the Bay Area in California, and he's a former writer for New Scientist, amongst others. He's just published a book called More Everything Forever: AI Overlords, Space Empires, and Silicon Valley's Crusade to Control the Fate of Humanity. And here he is on LLMs.
So LLMs are text generation engines. They do that by absorbing literally inhuman quantities of text from the internet, more text than any human could ever read in one lifetime, and then use that to, generate a model of language usage to figure out what the next word would be given the first word, and to keep doing that, so on and so forth. What's the third word going to be given the first two words, and so on. And so if you give it a prompt, it uses that model to say, okay, what's a plausible response given this text that has come in as input? There's no model of the world that comes with that. I mean, there's some knowledge about the world that's implicit in the structure of the text, but there's no notion of truth or falsehood at work here. And this is one of the things that really bugs me when people talk about AI hallucinations, when the AI, makes something up or gets a fact wrong. The idea behind that word hallucination, it makes it sound like when the AI is hallucinating, it's doing something different from what it usually does. But the fact is that the AI can only hallucinate.
Right.
It has no notion of truth or falsehood. And so when it makes up a fact, when it confabulates, it's doing the same thing that it does when it tells you something that happens to be true. Its relationship to truth and falsehood is purely accidental.
They have it. Everything they do is a hallucination. Nevertheless, there's a lot of talk about whether they're going to become sentient and whether more development along the line, more scale, as we've seen with ChatGPT getting better and better, will end up with this conscious entity.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about also the mystery of how LLMs work and how they produce such deep-sounding responses. Like you mentioned earlier, that line about being afraid of death, that feels, when you hear it, like something real.
It feels mysterious as well, doesn't it? Or I've always felt it does. Until I spoke with Emily Bender about this. And she's a computational linguist at the University of Washington. She's also got a new book out with Alex Hanna of the Distributed AI Research Institute. The book's called The AI Con: How to Fight Big Tech's Hype and Create the Future We Want. And here's Emily on the so-called mystery of LLMs.
I think the mystery dissolves if we take a closer look at what it is that language models are actually trained to do versus how they are used. At their core, language models are models of the distributions of word forms in text. Historically, language models have been used to rank possible strings as more or less likely compared to some training corpus. But what's happened with ChatGPT and Gemini and Claude and all the rest is that these basic functions have been turned inside out. So instead of asking which of these two possible strings is more likely, we are repeatedly asking what is a likely word to come next. With the size and amount of training data with today's large language models, what we have now is something that very closely models the distribution of word forms in text. And so the result of repeatedly asking that question is synthetic text that looks very plausible. If instead of treating that synthetic text as simply the result of closely modeling the distribution of word forms in text, we instead interpret it as answers to questions, maybe answers to a user's question or answer to a question from some licensing exam that has been misappropriated for evaluation, we end up with this seemingly mysterious situation where the models have this behavior that's hard to understand. What we have to keep in mind, though, is that if the models seem to be making sense, it's because we are making sense of the output. And so I think blowing this up as some mystery, and we're never going to understand how large language models work, is really looking at it from the wrong angle and comes about because we have misinterpreted what the output of these systems really is.
Alex, you've read the book. Do you agree with their presentation of it? And what about scaling up?
Yeah, so the book makes a really compelling argument in a lot of ways about why we should be careful about trusting these things. I did write in my review, and I do think that they were slightly one-sided in their presentation. There's loads of fascinating research into what is happening inside LLMs at scale and how we kind of grapple with these emergent capabilities that seem to pop up out of nowhere as the scale grows. As an example, you have things like quite complicated mathematical reasoning and argumentation that isn't just kind of convincing sounding text. These are producing real answers to real mathematical problems. It's a whole argument about what that's actually testing, and it's one that we don't have enough time for here, but I think it's a bit disingenuous to say that there is no mystery in these very large models.
Mystery is restored. Sophie?
I mean, related to the hype is the question of whether we can make an AI that is super intelligent. I mean, in fact, there's really two slightly different things here, this idea of super intelligence and artificial general intelligence.
Yeah, so this idea of superintelligence, you could argue that it already exists in very narrow domains. For instance, we've seen with playing chess, or protein folding. Google DeepMind has had huge success here in beating the best humans at both of those things. But what the AI companies are really after is artificial general intelligence, as Sophie suggests, and that's something slightly different. It's something that a few years ago you heard everyone talking about, this kind of really generalized intelligence that was better than humans in every domain. And we've seen all sorts of kind of scary predictions. We've seen these letters co-signed by thousands of researchers saying we need to pause training on large models until we work out that we can stop them achieving AGI and potentially getting out of control. But of course, there are many researchers who are still very skeptical that that's even a possibility and that AGI is a real thing.
So I'm not going to be covering a paper by an AI scientist anytime soon?
Possibly not. We've seen some very limited use cases for science where AI has been used to discover new materials or new algorithms, but each of these have been really hotly debated about how real they are, how useful they are. We had a case last year where Google came out with a inorganic crystal material discovery AI, and it was very exciting at the time, but then over the months, other researchers found that actually those crystals maybe had already been discovered before. It wasn't as new as it first seemed.
All right, but to go back to AGI specifically, why is it so desirable? I mean, it might not be possible, but the drive to get to AGI is what is fueling the hype, isn't it? The bubble. What about that first point? Why is it such a goal for these companies?
I mean, there's this kind of dream that once someone discovers AGI, they'll be able to control it and have control over the world. They might be able to use it to come up with advanced war plans that no one thought of, to control the economy, to influence the stock market, all of these ideas that are maybe interesting philosophical thought experiments, but it's not clear whether that's ever a thing that AGI, if it exists, could do.
And to go back to what we were talking about earlier about all that money, the $500 billion going into Stargate, that's why there's such a huge investment in this type of infrastructure.
I mean, how can they spend that much money? Can you tell us, physically, what does OpenAI, Sam Altman, what are they going to want to build with that money?
Yeah, so that 500 billion headline figure is actually an amalgamation from three different companies. It's OpenAI, it's SoftBank, this Japanese investment firm, and it's Oracle, which are this US cloud services and kind of data company. And between them, they want to build these vast data centers, which will basically just hold computer chips, a specialized kind of computer chips, graphical processing units, GPUs, and they will basically train the next generation of models. They will run requests that people feed into those models. And this was all built and commissioned when there was forecast to be an enormous increase in AI usage. And you can kind of debate whether we're still seeing that increase in usage as these data centers are being built now. And as Sophie was saying earlier, some of the funding has been scaled back and some of the data centers have been kind of cancelled. But that's essentially how the money's kind of going to be spent.
Okay, so that's why they're pouring so much money. They're having to build power stations at these facilities to feed the electricity demand as well, aren't they?
Yeah, and some of the energy predictions about how much AI is going to use is really quite insane. That there was a report from the US Department of Energy from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and it forecast by 2028 more than half of the electricity going to data centers will be used for AI. At that point, AI alone could consume as much electricity annually as 22% of all US households. And that's the US DOE that's saying that.
Wow. And this is why even a while ago we had people like Jeff Bezos saying we need to put these data centers on the moon because there you can just use solar energy and not worry about using fossil fuels down here and the huge energy drain that we'd have. I mean, it's because it's just incompatible with anything approaching a net zero idea, isn't it? Unless it's renewable, and we know it's not.
That's right. I mean, I think it's also kind of influenced by science fiction ideas, right? The whole concept of AGI, an AI that's like a person, AI on the moon. It feels like there's some maybe wishful thinking here, which might be why there's talk about a bubble, about this all being overhyped.
Yeah. I mean, but it's extraordinary that talk of this sort of sci-fi idea can just lead to this still massive investment, and that people with that money just don't go, no, that's a daft idea, we're not going to put $100 billion into it, but they do. Let's talk a bit about ethics now and then the threat, because when these chatbots and AI agents are trained on all this data and information, they're also guided by humans, and this is a process called reinforcement learning from human feedback. It's something I hadn't really thought about very much at all.
Right. This is how AI companies try to put guardrails on what their agents are able to output. So it won't, tell somebody how to build a bomb.
Right. Yeah. Here's Emily Bender again on this.
As we see more and more so-called guardrails being applied, trying to catch problematic inputs or outputs after the fact, we're going to see more and more cases where things have been applied clumsily and in a way that doesn't scale. And when these things go out in public and people can poke at it from so many different angles, I think we're going to see the result of that clumsy sort of kludged on additional guardrails applying. Now, does this mean that there shouldn't be guardrails? Certainly, there are things that we do not want systems outputting. And there has been an awful lot of work trying to do effectively content moderation on the large language models. A lot of that work has been done under terrible working conditions by people working in Kenya and Venezuela. And the result of that is that the output is less toxic than it would be otherwise. What is the better solution? I think we want to think very carefully about when we would ever want synthetic text flowing into our information ecosystem. And rather than trying to play whack-a-mole with the output of these synthetic text extruding machines, we should, I think, step back from this approach and go towards more narrowly scoped special purpose technology.
Well, I mean, it'd be nice if we can step back, but we might have already walked over the edge. What I didn't realize is the extent of the human training that goes on. And, we talked about the ethical concerns over the energy demand of these things, but, there's this human ethical dimension as well. And over the theft, basically, the scraping of all this copyrighted material that they use to make them, to feed them. For those reasons, Adam Becker calls it fruit of a poison tree if we use them, especially because of this human exploitation element. And here's Adam again.
There's an enormous human cost here as well. The reinforcement learning with human training that's being done to keep these large language models unsuccessfully, to keep them from producing harmful content, which does reduce the amount of harmful content they produce, but you can still get them to produce all sorts of horrible things. And there's all sorts of news stories about this, and rightly so. But the human training that's being done by that, it's mostly done in the developing world. And it carries this enormous psychological cost for the people who are doing that training. They are exposed to the worst things that these engines can produce. And again, they were trained on the entire internet, which is filled with all sorts of horrible things that people have produced over the last, 25, 35 years of the internet's existence. It's a real human cost. And also that real human, interaction with these things, like it's part of what makes these things look human is, well, there are some cases where a human just told them what to say. So all of that means that I really don't think that using these things as they exist now is ethically defensible.
And what that reminds me of actually is how there's this big middle class market for cocaine and people consuming it. Well, like people consuming it think they may be very ethical in other ways and buy, organic produce or something, cut down on meat and then get their cocaine. They ignore the back end, the human cost of cocaine production. And I feel like it's like that with these large language models.
Yeah, and in terms of the markets, I'm not sure it's easy to compare directly the middle-class cocaine use and LLM use. And we probably should run that through legal before we do. But the LLM market itself is absolutely enormous. You were referencing the Google I/O earlier. They put out some figures about how many tokens, which is effectively a word that the model puts out, and it's in the trillions, and that may not mean much, but that is comparable to almost the entire indexed internet that Google uses for its search algorithm every day. It's absolutely mind-boggling numbers. OpenAI have said that this year they've put on 4 times as many users. I think when they launched their image generation model this year, they were adding millions of users a day. The numbers are really kind of mind-boggling.
Wow.
Some of that's very confusing to me, though, because like you talked about tokens, like does that mean, are they counting, for instance, when I scroll past an AI summary that they automatically put at the top of the search results? Is that including all those? I've noticed all these new pop-ups asking me to use AI on various Google Docs and Sheets. And I think that it's tough to figure out just what people are using the AI for right now.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's really unclear kind of what those tokens refer to, and they really need to differentiate who is actually using this AI willingly and how much is it being kind of thrust upon us.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly true that they are thrusting upon us and they do want it being used as much as possible because they need to support all their plans for massive expansion.
Right.
So about threats, I think there's the sci-fi category of threats that we mentioned, Terminator and Skynet and like the 2001 A Space Odyssey where you have HAL, the computer there going insane and, trying to kill humans.
Oh, yeah. Any number of movies, Ex Machina.
Yeah. And so I think there's now a move to try and counter that narrative that we all have. And in the LA Times this week, there's a piece about how Google has this initiative called AI on Screen. And they want to portray AI in a kinder light, not nightmarish, they say. And they've already greenlit at least 2 movies. One's called Sweetwater, where a man returns to his childhood home and finds a hologram of his dead mother.
Not nightmarish at all.
Another one that's greenlit is called Lucid, about a couple who are they have really mundane lives. They want to escape it and live forever in a shared dream world of lucid dreams.
To me, that just sounds grim. Like that doesn't, I mean, that's literally nightmarish for me.
I mean, I wrote a piece about technology that would allow lucid and shared dreaming, but that wasn't an attempt to improve the image of AI. What they're doing, it's like not greenwashing, it's chip washing, right? Bot washing.
Ew.
Sorry to bring the level down there.
I mean, I think we're less concerned here with the end of the world scenarios, right, Alex?
Yeah, I mean, you do get experts who are really concerned with this, and the big AI companies, they do employ people that try and kind of look at these worst case scenarios and doomsday models and apocalypse scenarios. But there are very real concerns, as we've been talking about, that are present right now. You have things like AI bias. You have things like models putting out harmful content, as we were saying.
Yeah, the real threat, and this is really what we want to get over today, is the threat to truth, and democracy. And our world is just becoming flooded with this stuff. And how do you tell the difference?
And it's really hard to tell. And a lot of this stuff, as we were saying earlier, is kind of subtly put into things where we don't realize them, like these Google AI overviews.
Yeah.
I think with truth and democracy, it'll be a very kind of insidious process, and it'll be a very slow erosion where we don't realize the kind of building blocks of how we find out what is true or not are being slowly taken away from us. It might get into Wikipedia, it might get into our search results, and we just won't be able to tell until it's too late.
And even we're also constantly finding examples of these bots screwing up. There's a whole Reddit thread of cases where coders try over and over again to get an AI to correct its own mistakes, and it keeps failing. And then just recently, 2 different newspapers in the US published a syndicated list of summer reading books that included made-up titles. And it turns out the writer of this list had gotten some AI help but didn't fact-check the results and ended up with a mess. Obviously, humans aren't perfect. We make mistakes too. But I think the issue is that companies are kind of touting these bots as geniuses and encouraging us to trust them blindly. And that's not the case at all.
Yeah. Okay, look, finally, we've talked around this subject a lot, but is it a bubble? We've made it sound like it is a bubble. Do we think it's going to burst?
I mean, that really is the $500 billion question. As Sophie was saying earlier, we've already seen some scale back. I think venture capital and big tech companies, they may have overestimated demand. I'm sure they hope that they haven't, but they are really cramming AI features into every possible space they can find. And they're assuming that people's demand for this stuff is essentially limitless, that we're underusing it, if anything. I think they might actually find out that a lot of this stuff that they're trying out doesn't stick, that people don't want AI in their WhatsApp chats. They don't want AI summaries at the end of every kind of Zoom meeting. But even so, it does seem unlikely that all of this stuff is going to just completely disappear overnight. We can compare it to kind of the dot-com crash, which saw the disappearance of loads and loads of companies. But there were companies that kind of rose from the ashes there and that we still see today. We still see Google and we still see other companies that were around then that kind of survived. So it's going to be interesting to see.
Well, maybe the one that gets AGI will survive and all the rest will fall into the ashes.
Along with the rest of humanity.
And we'll end it on that note. I mean, look, I think ideally we would have some great regulation coming in now from a strong ethical government. But given that all of this is happening in the US, that is not going to happen with the government that they have over there at the moment. So I think the best thing that we can do is keep talking about this, raising these issues. And that's why we have podcasts. That's all for this week. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to The World, The Universe, and Us.
Do go ahead and subscribe and get in touch in the comments. We always like to hear from you.
We do, unless you're an AI. Thanks to all our guests, and thanks for listening.
We'll see you next week.
See you later.